If you would have told me the pitfalls that I would run into during this build, I probably would have chosen a different project to do. That being said, you learn from every mistake, and I make plenty here. In spite of that, I think the end product ended up being satisfactory. So come along and learn from all the mistakes that I make.
Let me fly towards my hands, towards my hands.
Greg and I really wanted to do end grain chessboards, so we bought these massive 12-quarter chunks of wood. Very expensive, but we figured we could make several chessboards if we made the boards thin enough. The squares will be walnut and cherry and 2 inches each. I'll then make the border out of walnut. I start by planing the walnut and cherry planks to 3 inches tall. I'll then rip them on my table saw, the blade of which can be raised to just over 3 inches. I set my fence to just a hair over 2 inches wide because I want to send them through my planer afterwards to make sure they are perfectly flat and square and as close to exactly 2 inches as I can get them. I think you can see my table saw is a job site table saw and really is not the best for cutting through 3 inches of hardwood. I was able to make it work, but it was really struggling through every rip. Next, I plane them to exactly 2 inches on 2 parallel sides. Ideally, I would plane them flat once they're all glued together, but unfortunately, my planer is only 13 inches wide and all the boards together will be 16 inches, so that won't work. Instead, I glue 2 groups of 4 boards together, let them dry, and then plane them each to exactly 2 inches. Then I can do one more glue up with both groups of boards and only worry about one seam, which I will then be meticulous about getting completely straight. I was planning on putting some clamps vertically right on the seam, but I was able to get it clamped pretty much perfectly without. I unclamp it and clean up the glue from the seam. Off camera, I put this on my crosscut sled and cut one end of the board exactly square so that I could then make all the crosscuts using just the fence. I originally thought it would be easier to use the sled for all the cuts, but I found I preferred the fence in this case. The fence is set at 1/2 inch, and if my calculations are correct, I should be able to get 3 boards out of this. So this is when things go downhill. I wanted to try a technique I saw from a YouTube channel called Would You Make It? He makes incredible chessboards. Sometimes he'll glue his chess squares to a plywood substrate to make it more solid. So I tried to do that here, except I was super cheap and instead of plywood, I thought I could make 1/2 inch MDF work. Let me just tell you right now, it super does not. At first, I was hopeful. After taking the clamps off, it looked pretty good and not much bow here. I set to sanding it flat, and this is when it would be super nice to have a drum sander. I finished up the sanding and left it overnight, and when I came out the next day, the entire board had cupped really bad. Like super bad. It's hard to tell from this angle, but it was bad. The only thing I could think of to save it was to flatten the top and then build the frame to be lower than the board so that the bottom would be open and allow the middle to sag a bit. So I built a router sled that would work with my little Harbor Freight trim router and went to work on it. It seemed to work pretty good, so I left it overnight, and you'll never guess what happened. It cupped again. So I jumped online to try and find some way to stop the cupping and came across someone who used a wet towel and a clothing iron to flatten it out, and then they clamped it real good and let it set. Initial efforts had me hopeful that this method would work, so I clamped it up and let it sit for a day. So hopeful that it would at last be flat. Trash. As you can see, that did not work out. So the next idea I had was that I would just build the frame to be super solid and then glue and clamp my abomination of a chessboard super good to the frame and pray that the frame would hold it flat. I rabbited the bottom edge so that the part resting on the frame, I'm not even going to bother you with the details this time because it also didn't work. Regardless, I moved on to the frame. I decided to miter the corners because I like making things difficult, but also miters look really nice. And I put it together with some biscuits and wood glue. Then I clamped it with a strap clamp. Once it dried, I sanded it nice and declared it ready to be joined to the main board. Problem was, the main board had begun to cup even more. I wish I could find a picture of it. It cupped so much that the entire sheet of MDF was splitting and separating from the chessboard top. Needless to say, I decided I should take a break from the project. When I took another crack at it, I decided that I needed the clamping table that Mike from Would You Make It uses. So I pieced together a rough idea of how he made his based on some clips from a few videos and some comments that he made about it. It's rough, but the top is flat and it does the job. I still had enough chessboard strips for 2 more boards, so I grabbed 8 of them to make another top. But this time, I decided not to use anything for a substrate and just glue the strips to themselves only. The clamping table worked wonderfully. I inspected it and it looked all right. It was very flat. It just needed to be smoothed out with a sander. I started with a belt sander because that was my best bet at keeping it flat. Also, there was a lot of material to remove, so running it with an 80 grit belt worked pretty good. I upped it to 120 grit belt later and did a little test with the frame. Then I hit it with an orbital sander at 150 grit, marking it with a pencil so I could sand it all evenly, and did another test fit. Looking at the frame, I thought it was a bit plain, and I have access to a laser engraver, so I decided to try engraving a simple design. I then put a chamfer on the edge and concluded that the engraved areas needed gold leaf, which I had never done before. For gold leaf, you start with putting a sealer where you'll be applying the leaf. Then you apply the adhesive and let that dry for 30 minutes or so. And finally, you apply the leaf. This is my first time using any kind of leaf, so I'm not sure how gold leaf is supposed to act, but this stuff is messy, very brittle. It seems to almost dissolve into gold glitter. I was a cheapskate when I decided on this stuff, so I'm not mad about it, just an observation. I discovered that the leaf did not stick to the engraved areas that well. There were lots of gaps with no gold leaf. So I put another layer of adhesive and more gold leaf. This time it covered a lot better. Not perfect, but it was good enough for me. I think that gold leaf really sticks well to smooth surfaces, so since the engraved portion wasn't super smooth, it is just burned wood after all, it had a hard time adhering well. Now, for connecting the board to the frame, I naively thought I could just use 5-minute epoxy in the corners and call it good. That was very stupid. It broke apart a few minutes after taking off the clamps. But man, it looked good. Little did I know, it would never look that good again. I know, depressing. So I cleaned up the epoxy with the sander, and to be dramatic, this is where my final mistake just broke me. I was careless with my sanding and my engraving wasn't that deep. I sanded right through the gold leaf. So, in a fit of rage, as you can see, I sanded all the rest of the gold leaf off and shelved the project for several months. I had plenty of other things going on during this time, but throughout it all, I knew I needed to finish the board. I was so close. So mid-October, I decided it was time. This time, I went super simple. No need to complicate things. I used dowels, one in each corner, and wood glue. Clamped it and let it dry. The first part in finishing this was this sanding sealer. That overspray is incredible. I sanded it real quick with a high grit sandpaper and then started on the lacquer. This stuff says brushing lacquer, but I find that it sprays fine too. I ended up doing 3 coats with this stuff until it had that smooth, shiny look that I was going for. Overall, I think it turned out good. But as they say, good things never last. So keep an eye on the channel for the next adventure with this cursed board. Thanks for watching.